In the winter of 1945, American soldiers were vanishing inside territory controlled by an ally, and the people responsible for bringing them home were filling out paperwork instead of doing it. Have you ever watched a system fail someone right in front of you and felt completely powerless to stop it? Have you ever made a decision that you knew was right even though everyone above you said it was wrong? The answer to both of those questions is what this story is really about. By early 1945, the war in Europe was grinding toward its end, and the Soviet Red Army was pushing westward through Poland and Eastern Germany with enormous force and enormous speed. As it moved, it was rolling over German military positions, flattening supply lines, and liberating the prisoner of war camps that the Nazi regime had scattered across occupied territory. Inside those camps were British soldiers, French soldiers, and a significant number of American soldiers who had been sitting behind German wire for months, and in some cases years. When the Red Army arrived at those camps, the Americans expected liberation. What they got was something considerably more complicated than that. The Yalta Agreement, signed by Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin in February 1945, had a specific section dealing with exactly this situation. It said that liberated Allied prisoners of war would be gathered at collection points near the front, provided with food and shelter and medical care, and returned to their home countries as fast as possible. The language was clear, the obligations were specific, and the Soviet government was not honoring them. This is where the story becomes something more than a wartime administrative dispute, because what happened to those men in the weeks and months that followed tells you something important about power, about bureaucracy, about the difference between an agreement on paper and an agreement in practice, and about what one commander decided to do when the system designed to protect his soldiers stopped working. The Americans being held in Soviet-controlled territory were not experiencing the deliberate brutality of the German camps they had just left. Nobody was systematically starving them or working them to death, but they were being held. They were not being moved west toward American lines. In some cases, they were being moved east, deeper into Soviet territory, in exactly the opposite direction that repatriation would require. The collection points that the Yalta Agreement described were not functioning the way the agreement described them functioning. Medical care was inadequate, food was insufficient, and the process of getting these men home was moving at the specific speed of an institution that has been told quietly not to hurry. Why was the Soviet government doing this? The historians who have spent decades studying the question have settled on several answers that are probably all partially correct. The Soviet Union had its own massive repatriation problem involving millions of Soviet citizens who had been in German-controlled territory as prisoners and forced laborers, and Stalin wanted American cooperation in getting those people back. Holding American prisoners gave him something to leverage. The Soviet intelligence services also had a professional interest in debriefing the Americans about what they had seen and heard during their captivity, and that takes time and requires keeping the subjects close. And then there is the third possibility, which is that Soviet military bureaucracy at this level had a kind of institutional gravity that made things slow down even when nobody had explicitly told them to. The problem with that third possibility is that it is almost impossible to distinguish from the first two from the outside. George Patton was not spending much time on the question of why. Patton was commanding the Third Army through its drive across Germany, and the Third Army's advance was uncovering the physical evidence of what the Third Reich had been doing to people for 12 years. Concentration camps, forced labor installations, prison facilities, the administrative machinery of organized murder. Patton was managing the military operations and the logistical requirements of an army in full offensive motion while simultaneously managing the immediate human crises that the advance kept producing every single day. The American prisoners in Soviet territory were a crisis he could not manage directly because they were not in his operational zone. They were behind Soviet lines, in territory where American military authority did not reach, in the custody of an Allied army that American forces needed to cooperate with to finish the war. The official process for dealing with their situation moved upward through the American military hierarchy to Eisenhower, from Eisenhower through diplomatic channels to the Soviet government, and from the Soviet government back through the same channels in the form of responses that had the shape of cooperation without the substance of it. Patton was receiving reports from officers who had been sent into Soviet-controlled territory under the contact team provisions of the Yalta Agreement. These were American military personnel authorized to go to the collection points, verify that the obligations were being met, and assist with the repatriation process. The contact teams were not getting access. They were being delayed at checkpoints. They were being told that the prisoners had already been moved to different locations. They were being handed paperwork and given assurances and denied the physical access that would allow them to confirm whether any of it was true. The Soviet military bureaucracy was generating the appearance of cooperation in enormous quantities while producing the actual substance of it in almost none. The situation in Moscow was telling the same story from a different angle. General John Dean, who headed the American military mission in Moscow and had been dealing with Soviet military counterparts on coordination questions since 1943, had been documenting this pattern with increasing frustration. Dean had sent a cable to Washington in November 1944 that said something direct and uncomfortable. He said that the pattern of Soviet behavior in the military relationship was not accidental. He said the Soviets had concluded that American cooperation would continue regardless of whether the Soviets provided meaningful cooperation in return, and that the American policy of accommodation was therefore producing diminishing results. His recommendation was that the United States stop offering concessions to the Soviet Union without receiving concrete concessions in exchange. Washington received this recommendation and sat with it. The Roosevelt administration was not ready to harden its position toward the Soviets in the final months of the war. The alliance needed to hold together through the defeat of Germany and the planned war against Japan, and a diplomatic confrontation over prisoner treatment risked fracturing something that the final phase of the war depended on. By the time the administration might have been ready to act on Dean's analysis, Roosevelt was dead, Truman was in the White House, and the prisoner situation had become both more urgent and more politically complicated. Patton was not managing any of that diplomatic complexity. He was managing the Third Army and the men who were in it and the men who belonged in it, but were currently sitting in deteriorating conditions inside Soviet-controlled territory while the official channels processed the situation at their own pace. He made a decision. He was going to send his own people in. This was not authorized by Eisenhower. It was not coordinated with Soviet military command. It did not fit within the contact team framework that the Yalta Agreement had established for exactly this kind of mission. It was a commander deciding that the official process had failed, that the men could not wait for it to succeed, and that he was going to act on that conclusion regardless of what the proper channels said about the proper process. He identified officers with Russian language capability and the specific combination of operational judgment and personal flexibility that operating in Soviet-controlled territory without official authorization would require. The officer he put in charge of the mission was Major Ernest Grunberg, a man with both the language skills and the temperament that the situation demanded. Grunberg took a small team east across into Soviet-controlled areas with simple orders. Find the Americans, assess their condition, start moving them west. Here is the part of this story that I think matters most. Think about what Grunberg was walking into. He had no authorization from the Soviet military. He had no documentation that fit the official framework. He was crossing into territory controlled by an army that had not agreed to what he was doing, on behalf of a mission that did not officially exist, to retrieve men who were in the custody of an institution that had not agreed to release them. If this goes wrong in any number of ways, there is no official cover to protect him because the mission has no official existence. And he went anyway. What Grunberg found when he reached those areas confirmed the worst of what the informal reports had been suggesting. Americans were scattered across multiple locations. Their conditions ranged from miserable to genuinely dangerous. The men had survived years of German captivity and were now experiencing weeks of Soviet custody that was doing nothing to improve their physical condition and, in some cases, was actively worsening it. The Soviet personnel responsible for them were operating under instructions that clearly did not treat the Yalta repatriation timeline as a priority. Grunberg began moving men. He did not request authorization. He did not submit documentation requests through established channels. He identified Americans wherever he found them, got them on their feet, and pointed them west toward Third Army lines. The Soviet military's response was the response of a bureaucracy that has been bypassed by someone who has decided the bureaucracy's timeline is unacceptable. Checkpoints demanded documentation the mission did not have. Soviet officers demanded explanations the team could not officially provide. Communications went up the chain on the Soviet side expressing displeasure at the unauthorized American operation and requesting that it be stopped through proper channels. Patton did not stop it. The Soviet complaints reached Eisenhower. They reached him in the form of official military communications expressing the Red Army's objection to unauthorized American activities in the Soviet-controlled territory. Eisenhower sent communications down to Patton about the need to operate through established channels. Patton received those communications. He acknowledged them, and the operation continued. If you have been watching this and thinking about what you would have done in Patton's position, getting reports from Grunberg about the conditions those men were living in, knowing that the official process was producing insufficient results, knowing that your superiors were asking you to stand down, what is the right call? I genuinely want to know what you think. So put your answer in the comments right now. Because what Patton was doing was not simply breaking rules. He was making a calculation about which obligation mattered more. His obligation to the chain of command and to the diplomatic relationship the chain of command was trying to preserve, or his obligation to the men in Soviet custody who were in deteriorating condition and whose situation the official channels were not resolving. He decided the second obligation outweighed the first, and he was willing to absorb the consequences of that decision. This is the pattern that defined Patton throughout the war. He had done it in Sicily. He had done it in France. He had a specific and consistent relationship with authority that could be summarized as, I will operate within the chain of command until I believe the chain of command is wrong, at which point I will act on my own judgment and deal with what follows. The slapping incidents, the speeches that caused diplomatic problems, the tactical decisions made without waiting for authorization from above. All of it comes from the same place. A commander who trusted his own assessment over the institutional assessment and who had a strong enough record of being right that the institution kept tolerating it. The men Grunberg's operation moved westward began arriving at Third Army positions. They were in poor shape. The combination of years in German captivity and weeks in Soviet custody had done real physical damage, and the medical facilities at Third Army headquarters were dealing with it urgently. Patton visited some of them personally. These were not visits staged for public relations purposes or designed to produce photographs for the press. He went because he needed to see directly what had happened to soldiers who had been in someone else's custody and what the gap looked like between what the Yalta Agreement had promised them and what they had actually received. What he saw in those visits settled something in him. He had already been developing a view of the Soviet system through the spring of 1945 that was considerably darker than the official American position on the wartime ally. The men coming back from Soviet custody, the condition they were in, the stories they were telling, confirmed every element of that view. The Soviets had not treated these men with the organized cruelty of the German system. They had not run them through the machinery of deliberate dehumanization that the concentration camps represented, but they had treated them as instruments of policy rather than as individuals. They had used them as leverage in a repatriation negotiation that the Soviet side was conducting on the assumption that American cooperation was available at a discount because the Americans needed Soviet military cooperation more than the Soviets needed American goodwill. That calculation, the premise that American accommodation would continue regardless of Soviet behavior, is the calculation that Dean had identified in his November 1944 cable. And it was the calculation that Patton's unauthorized operation had directly challenged by demonstrating that American accommodation had limits and that at least one American commander was willing to go around the established process when the established process stopped producing results. Patton said things about all of this. He said them to his staff, and he said them in his diary, and he said them to the politicians and journalists and military visitors who were arriving in Germany through the summer of 1945 to see what the victory looked like. He said things that were extreme in their framing and that created political problems for Eisenhower and for the diplomatic relationship with the Soviet Union. He suggested that the Americans had spent years defeating the wrong enemy and were now going to have to face a different version of the same problem. He was sufficiently direct about this that it contributed to his eventual removal from the Third Army Command in the fall of 1945, replaced with a ceremonial position that removed him from anything operationally significant. The prisoner repatriation question was eventually resolved in the incomplete and unsatisfying way that questions get resolved when one party to an agreement has decided not to honor it fully. The majority of American prisoners liberated by Soviet forces were eventually returned through a combination of official diplomatic pressure and the unofficial operations that Patton had authorized and Eisenhower had tolerated despite the diplomatic discomfort they produced. But not all of them. The accounting for American prisoners in Soviet-controlled territory at the end of the war has never been complete. There are men whose fates remain in Soviet archives that were not fully opened after the Cold War ended, and that subsequent Russian governments have not made available to American families and researchers who have been asking for access ever since. The question of whether American prisoners of war were held in the Soviet Union beyond the repatriation period is a question that the available evidence does not fully close. The unavailable evidence, the archives that remain sealed, may or may not close it if anyone ever gets access. What the available evidence does establish clearly is that the Soviet government violated its Yalta obligations on prisoner repatriation in the spring of 1945, that the violation was deliberate rather than administrative, that the official American response to it was inadequate for the scale of what was happening, and that the most effective response to it came from a commander who decided the official channels had run out of time and sent his own people in without permission. Patton died in December 1945, killed in a car accident in Heidelberg before the full dimensions of what had happened to American prisoners in Soviet custody were understood, and before the Cold War had taken on the shape that would make his instincts about Soviet intentions look prescient rather than reckless. He died believing that the United States had failed the men who were not fully accounted for, that the failure was the result of prioritizing the diplomatic relationship over the specific human obligations that a signed agreement had created, and that the accommodation the American government had offered the Soviet Union in exchange for cooperation had produced far less cooperation than it should have. He was not wrong. The men who came back, the ones who arrived at Third Army positions in the spring of 1945 after Grunberg's operation moved them out of Soviet-controlled territory, are the evidence that the instinct was correct, that the action was justified, and that the official channels were producing results that were insufficient for the men who were waiting inside them. They came home because Patton sent someone to get them, not through the Yalta framework, not with Soviet authorization, not with a signed approval from Eisenhower's headquarters, through the specific, unauthorized, consequence-accepting directness of a commander who looked at the situation, made a judgment, and acted on it. He was right, and the men came home. The question history leaves open is how many did not, and whose decision that was. Some of you are already subscribed. Thank you, genuinely. If you are not yet, this is your sign. Join us. There is much more coming.